a fun presentation to put together. And so I want to put the disclaimer out there like they do on TV, right? You know, the names have been changed to protect the innocent, but these are literally some real life stories that I'm going to get into, right? So who doesn't like scary stories as long as they aren't about you, right? So we're gonna try to cover a lot of ground on these things, and then hopefully there's some good tips and tricks here along the way. So PEOs, right? Who doesn't like PEOs? So what happened? We had a client that is actually a pretty good sized client in this area, in the DMV area, that had regular benefits and decided that they went to a PEO model to save money. Their primary reason for making the change was to reap some savings on their benefits. So not really a lot of the other components to the PEO, but that specifically. 2 years later, they got their renewal and saw some sticker shock as they had a 40% increase. And of course, by the time that this came around, there was a bit of a scramble to try to see what they were going to do about this. So, yeah, that's the start of the tale. So why even kind of get into this? PEOs, right? Let's talk about really what they are. And I think if I go through some very basic things that I maybe most of us understand, I just want to make sure I don't leave anything to. So what is a PEO, or a professional employer organization? It is a company that establishes a joint employment relationship, right? So where essentially you are leasing employees back, and that thereby allowing the PEO to share and manage the employer-related responsibilities, liabilities, to functionally. And so that's what the actual dynamic is, right? It's a co-employment relationship, and then they take on a variety of tasks as a result of that. So there's parts of benefits, although not all benefits in some situations, compensation, payroll, workers' comp, and oftentimes some elements of HR. So there's a lot of obvious, I think, advantages to why that model might have some attractiveness. There may be certain situations where there is a cost savings on some or a handful of these items. So that's really important to kind of to look at. They certainly are big on providing economies of scale, because a smaller size to mid-sized group now becomes a massive group. And kind of the bundling and admin approach can be very, very value added, where you got payroll, admin, support, et cetera. So there's components of streamlining certain things that you would already have to be doing, but might be doing in a couple of different places. Certainly it can help having workers' comp and payroll theoretically a little bit better aligned, and help with some compliance and HR assistance. So again, certainly there can be a lot of reasons and a lot of value to looking at this, but I think what I really want everyone to recognize is it's not where, I think it's not marketed as in a balanced manner as I would like to see it be marketed. So sometimes it kind of comes across like it is the assumptive solution if you fit a certain profile, and I would very directly tell you that isn't always the case. So anyone and everyone, regardless of size, capacity, what you have going on, should really try to see this in the full context. So number one, you are still responsible for the employees. So I think sometimes this gets lost in it, sometimes in the way that things are marketed, that it's not like by going into this relationship, you have transferred away some of the risks and responsibilities. So that if that wasn't apparent or obvious, let it be so. There's also a loss of control, because the PEO has its own framework for benefits, enrollment, et cetera. So whatever they provide, that is what you get access to. However, if that isn't maybe from a provider standpoint, and I'll give you another example where there was a particular national insurance carrier that was the predominant one being offered, but for one group that had a few employees in states in the Northwest, they felt that and they knew that carrier actually didn't have a great network. And so it created some concerns for them. Again, arbitrary times for open enrollment, et cetera. So just understanding that what they say goes in this relationship, and whether or not you feel that that optimally aligns to what you're looking for, that's part of the deal. You do have to recognize that there are additional data security concerns. Now, that really, frankly, I think would exist regardless of what type of structure you have, whether you work directly with a benefits broker, whether you go through a Ben admin platform with payroll. But it's just always very important to recognize whoever's handling certain components of data, you really want to understand what's at risk, how is it being handled, get a pretty clear idea as to who's responsible for what, how do they go about protecting that data. So the data security part, I think, is really an area where we encourage people to get a very, very clear understanding about that. Also, workers' compensation. PEOs operate this for you, but workers' compensation is all built around proper employee classification. And sometimes I think, unless you're really engaged with that process, we've seen, unfortunately, that things can be done in a bit of a more generic way. Can I put it generously? So just it's really important that even if they are facilitating that for you, that you're managing that you're looking at that you're paying attention to it, because that that can have ramifications, and you'll still have audit issues if you have misclassifications. And then to also understand, again, just what it is and what it isn't. They have limited HR assistance, but it's not, I would say, a full true, as if you hired your own HR consultant. So just very, very important to understand, well, what does it look like? What HR assistance do you provide? And also, what do we still retain? What responsibilities do we have? Because again, co-employment, you still have a lot of the HR responsibilities. So I think that that's really important. And lastly, like I said, I think a PEO is an option, but you should still feel encouraged to go out and find out what it would be like to not work with them. See what it looks like to build out a plan for yourself and just test the market, because we found many times, even for small to even mid-sized groups, that there is still a lot of good plans and platforms that they can set up and be very cost effective with. And so I think just for the benefit of anyone trying to make that decision, you want to see it in the full context, so you feel like you're getting a full market analysis before you dive right in. The good news is they did ultimately peel back out of it and got back on track ever since. But it was a pretty challenging experience, and it was definitely a lot of hot-handedness to turn around in a very short window of time. So. Okay, next up, right? Here's Johnny. We had a client set up their retirement plan through a payroll provider. We were not a part of this. In fact, by the time that we started working with them, this was already the way that they were set up. And a year or two into supporting them, they reached out to us with a big concern because they didn't understand that they had a failed plan test, which involved them having to back out plan contributions. And so, not sure if any of you had that experience, but let me just tell you, it is not fun, because anytime somebody has put money into a retirement plan, you better believe they kind of wanted it to stay in that plan. They don't want to have to get something corrected, back it out, and pay taxes on it. So why can this happen, or what's the issue? Retirement plans as a benefit, I think they really require more engagement than I think most people understand. So the first and most important thing to know is that the retirement plan is all governed by the plan document. And who gets to decide what the plan document says? Well, you do. And so sometimes when things are getting set up, depending on who you're working with, and especially a lot of situations where we've seen payroll providers involved, that plan design experience is not necessarily as collaborative as it should be, where you're given a lot of things and potentially kind of put into, well, here's a way we can go about setting it up that we use with a lot of people. And while that may be okay, the reality is you have the opportunity to customize everything from eligibility to vesting, safe harbor, not safe harbor, all of the parts that go into the retirement plan should be at your discretion, and you get to determine that. So when you have a plan test that has failed, it's probably because that process either wasn't built right from the beginning, or nobody's worked with you on an ongoing basis to kind of see, hey, it looks like we could be, at risk for plan testing failure. What do we want to do about that? How can we create a scenario or work with you to amend your plan document to avoid this moving forward? So make sure, if you haven't looked at your plan document, or if you don't know what that experience is like for you, now might be a really good time just to take a look at it and make sure it's built right, written right, designed right. It also might not be with the right provider, whether it's a payroll provider, whether it's just somebody out in the marketplace. You really want to know how your plan would be optimized and what are the best providers to be working with, to be considering for your plan based on the amount of money that's in it, the number of participants, the average annual flows, et cetera. So we always recommend, a lot of times organizations consider doing just a plan market audit every 3 to 5 years. Can be more frequently, can be, well, I don't necessarily think it would be more frequently. It could be less frequently depending on how quickly or slowly the plan grows in size. But it's just a good way to kind of, take a little step back, do some due diligence, do a little fiduciary benchmarking, and just make sure that things are still optimized to the best of their abilities. The reason why I say it's important to do this and have it be a market analysis is that plans are priced based on how much money is in them and how many participants there are. So it's not, you couldn't compare $1 million plan and a $10 million plan, because the market pricing is obviously a little bit different. You want to stand your own plan up and allow it to be competed on an apples to apples basis. Don't also let cost lead you to selecting the wrong type of plan. Let me give you an example of what I mean by this. I've seen certain situations where some organizations set up simple plans. And in fact, some of you may have had that or may have one. But the reason why it was set up that way was to try to avoid plan administration costs, when there might be a lot of advantages to moving into a more conventional 401k plan, but we kind of turned away from that just because of the cost portion. So that's one thing that you really, you want to have cost be a balanced conversation. Certainly you don't want to pay too much or have to pay expenses that might not be as reasonable depending on your situation. But I think letting cost kind of be the Trump filter that you push everything through can be really challenging, especially in this situation. We've seen non-safe harbor 401ks. That was the example that we gave here. The plan should have been designed as a safe harbor plan, and it wasn't. And had it been designed the right way, it would have saved them a lot of time, headache, and hassle. And then also, and this might be obvious, but the Staples easy button approach of setting up benefits probably doesn't exist. And so a lot of times, especially when it comes to marketing of, hey, my payroll provider can, check all these boxes, and at the push of a button, everything's set up. That I'm not dismissing the value there, but it also isn't necessarily that easy. So understanding how to manage and operate a retirement plan effectively, and the fact that there is a lot of behind the scenes compliance involved, just important to not, I think, let the allure of that steer you down the wrong path. How do you build it right from the beginning? I've covered a lot of this, so I'll try to keep up at a good pace. Yes, proper plan design is not arbitrary. So if it wasn't built right, fix it. Everybody can make amendments, and frankly, it might be good to amendments on an ongoing basis. There is a good market out there, regardless of your plan size. So don't get the impression we don't have enough money or we're not big enough. It's still a good idea to just kind of see what is available to you. Not to suggest that means you have to change, but it's always good to know kind of where you stand. And I think support really does matter. Most of the time, we don't necessarily see issues with the plan design, but we do get a lot of opportunities to work with people because they're complaining that they just don't get any service. Their payroll provider is not helping them. Or whoever they've been working with for the last 5 years, they don't know who to talk to. They don't like calling an 800 number. Somebody's trying to take out a loan. They don't know. So, a lot of that really does matter because especially with limited resources, time, energy, and the number of hats a lot of you all wear, you probably don't want to have that many more phone calls to make to get something that should be relatively simple done. So do pay attention to the kind of support you can expect based on how you have your setup or what you might be looking at. And the last part is hugely critical. Employee education, I think, is a much bigger deal than most employers are realizing and recognizing. And I think this is only going to grow in prominence. So if you do not have a provider or a broker relationship where you are getting a lot of help providing maximum amount of education, resources, materials, et cetera, so that way employees can be engaged, you need to look at that because that is a big point of emphasis. That's going to also be a regulatory and compliance concern from a fiduciary management standpoint. So it's certainly something to pay attention to. All right, we just keep on rolling. Payroll problem. Okay, clients set up their benefits, workers' comp through payroll, again, similar to the retirement plan because it was easy and convenient. Only to find out they had some problems with their workers' comp on an audit. And they also received their renewals from the payroll provider for their core benefits a bit late, within kind of 30 days and sometimes less, rather than what would have been, you know, closer to 60 at a minimum 45 days. So they had kind of time to review and assess them. So not a fun situation that they were going through. So I think that the point that I want to emphasize, payroll should be good at payroll. They may be good at a lot of other things, and I am not trying to denigrate having more services through a payroll relationship. But you want to make sure that you are assessing all of those elements, I think, for what they are and maybe also for what they aren't. So read the fine print of a lot of these proposals that might come. You know, what is the actual cost of having these additional bundled services through a payroll relationship? Because, you know, obviously there is a cost, and does it make sense? And also get an understanding as to who's going to handle what, because sometimes we find that by bundling things together, you don't necessarily have additional help or support. You just have the convenience factor of knowing that everything kind of flows through one portal. But if it means that maybe in some respect, you're going to have to still manage a lot more of that, then you might want to, you know, determine if that's still the best way to go. We've already talked about it, but service and support matter. And in some respects, having partners that you can count on that can give you advice, not just provide the functional capacity. Because frankly, there's a lot of people that can do that don't have to be through a payroll provider. So you really want to understand, okay, if we go this direction, or if we continue with this direction, if we're already in this situation, is that going to be the best way to handle that? Are they going to tell us what to do? Are they going to give us advice? Are they going to give us support? Are they going to help, you know, walk through a benefits renewal and give us a broad market of options to choose from at renewal time, et cetera? What is that going to look like? And I can't underscore getting benefits advice. It matters. There's a great market of brokers out there, and sometimes a broker can be your best friend when it comes to these things. And so payroll providers are not necessarily what we like to say, they're not insurance people. They just play them on TV. So again, just know what you're dealing with, know what you're operating with, and be very good at unpacking all of these things so that you can see them for what they really are. Oh, yes, probably one of my favorites, the HR consultant. And by the way, the full disclosure, we love HR consultants and work with a lot of them in partnership over the years. However, sometimes we've had some challenges. So in this particular situation, the challenges were I think, somewhat significant, or at least had the potential for some consequence. The reason why the consultant was hired was during a time of transition. And again, makes a lot of sense, because certainly if you have an executive transition going on, to kind of make that as minimally impactful as possible, you probably want as many people helping you with that as you can. And so I totally, completely understood why. The issues that they had, however, during the transition was all of a sudden the HR consultant wanted to kind of put their hands on a lot of things, and I think kind of went in with the assumption that they would be doing virtually almost everything, such as enrolling new employees for benefits. And also when they came around for a benefits renewal, they had some strong ideas about some of the alternative recommendations that were being made, and communicated that even though their benefits broker made a proposal that said, we think you need to make a change to enhance your short-term disability plan because it was frankly inadequate, below the market average, and had some gaps. They communicated to them that they did not think that was in their best interest because they had concerns about the language of the policy as it relates to DC family medical leave. And so they put a stop on it instead of turning around and communicating more effectively with the benefits broker about trying to examine the language in the policy, but still moving ahead. So it was not a good situation. The client had to renew a short-term disability plan that actually was not good coverage for their employees for a period of 3 months until they were able to kind of sort through the concern. And thankfully, there were no claims during that period of time, but had there been, that would have been a bad situation for the employee, knowing that they could have had a better plan set up. So what does all that mean? I think first thing is to, why hire a consultant, whether it's HR or otherwise? Why bring somebody on in a consulting role? I think sometimes there might be, we've heard people share that they have concerns that they just don't have the capacity, or my own people aren't necessarily up to the challenge. And I completely understand that and appreciate that. I think though, it's really important to know, what are you really looking for? What do you need? When you think of HR, sometimes it seems like a very nebulous and very scary dynamic, and yet, it's one that has a lot of definition to it. And so sometimes just having a better, clear understanding of the roles, responsibilities, and needs can help you clear through that. And frankly, whether you end up hiring one or not, create a much better working relationship, because you'll really pinpoint, this is what I need you to come in and do. This is the functional capacity that we expect. I think a lot of times it's that fear of the unknown, and almost this assumption that I need to hire somebody that gets this because I have all of these potential issues and I don't know that we can handle them. And again, just making sure that you really assess that on a more granular level, I think will make that process much more effective. Also, just, the assumption, we've again had sometimes a board might say, hey, you need to check this HR box. I think maybe you need to hire a consultant. Okay, maybe yes, maybe no, but just understanding, what do you mean? What does it look like to check our proverbial HR box? Let's be real clear about it. Certainly paying a consultant could be more effective than hiring in-house, but again, I think it's better and more appropriate to figure out what your organization's needs are, and maybe frankly, you need to spend the money or bring somebody in because your needs might be a little bit more substantial and long-term, because a lot of times the challenge is, consultants usually have a start and an end, but if you have an ongoing need, it might not be the most effective way. Might be reasonable for a stopgap. Again, for the group that we worked with that had a CEO transition, the contract was designed to run concurrent till they got a new CEO and then transition away. Totally makes sense, but I think sometimes there's a little bit, it's less defined. There's a little bit too much ambiguity about when does this end? When do we feel like we don't need it anymore, or we have kind of a better handle on these issues? And certainly making sure that your policies and procedures can go a long way. And sometimes cleaning them up, making them clear, making them more effective helps. I'm not suggesting that that's all that is required to have good HR, but I think that it's certainly, we've found that's a significant benefit to go through and just make sure that you have enough documentation for all the things that you need to have documented. Now, as I was saying, right, what are the legitimate needs that you have? I think that, yeah, we've encouraged organizations that are talking to us about that, or even working with us and taking advantage of some of our HR consulting capacity. We'll oftentimes say, well, what do you really need? And give us as clear of an understanding, almost in the format of like a job description. Let's define what the deliverables really need to be. Or maybe you're not sure and you want to create a scope of work for somebody to come in and look at you and help audit your needs, so that way you can define them. But again, I think that just creating the right framework goes a long way. Back to the issue that I said, the HR consultant came in and started to kind of essentially do a lot of things that disrupted the flow. She became an additional person processing things and kind of getting in the way of a process that was unnecessary. The issue with that was they didn't have a clearly defined role of who should be doing what. And I think in this situation, she felt like, because there wasn't that definition, that she needed to do more than she actually had to do. So that was part of the problem, right? They didn't have a very clear expectation of, this is what you need to come in and do for us. She started to kind of put her hands in a lot of different things. And I fault both parties for that, because again, I can completely understand somebody coming in trying to do their best work when they haven't been given clear direction. And then I think the last thing is, do not underestimate the value of people who are insurance professionals, who can give you that insurance and benefits advice. One thing that we've seen with some providers is that, we have all the licenses, expertise, compliance, wherewithal, designations, et cetera, to provide you with a market and advice and tell you what to do. And then sometimes that information then goes over and they say, well, okay, HR consultant, what do you think? Which again, we certainly understand and appreciate. However, HR consultants, like payroll should be good at payroll, HR consultants should be good at HR, but they also, the good ones will tell you, well, I can look at this through this lens, but as somebody who's not licensed in insurance, who doesn't do this part, I can maybe only give you certain advice and guidance. So it's almost just make sure, who do you really need to get advice from? Why would you need an HR consultant to look at something if you've received it from somebody else that's an expert in that space? So I just think that these are some of these key components to avoiding some of these challenges moving forward. And hopefully, again, the clearer you can be helps all of the people that can help and support you work on your behalf and not feel like you have to go to 3 different people to get one answer. So to kind of round things out, I think certainly the decision-making framework is the key. A culture first mentality and seeing things holistically from a leadership standpoint, as we see, makes kind of everything fit best. Certainly hiring to culture, not just technical competency, has been proven to create a better working dynamic. It certainly also allows people to stay longer. And I think it allows you as a decision maker or an executive to feel more comfortable and confident when you're making these very granular decisions about, how do I deploy benefits, or how do my benefits actually need to be delivered, so that way they can be perceived as valuable. I think a lot of times organizations have a great benefits lineup, but don't get the juice that they should, simply because their employees don't understand. It's not that they need to do more, spend more, have more. It's that there's a lack of education, so that way employees can appreciate, understand, better connect to. So I think that's really important. Obviously, you don't want to make decisions in a vacuum. So know all of the options. Make a proper market assessment. Line up a PEO and everything else. Line up a payroll opportunity with a PEO and everything else. Just see everything for what it is and what it isn't. And I think from that standpoint, again, you've got the whole landscape in front of you. You can make an informed choice of what's going to be the most important way to go for your organization. Be mindful of technology. I think that we are in a digital society. However, especially as virtual organizations, we can't forget about the human element of HR and the need to collaborate effectively, the need to engage on a more personal level. And so, just make sure that what you're delivering empowers you and also brings you together, doesn't create issues, headaches, barriers to communication, etc. Again, don't let cost be the first filter everything goes through. You do get what you pay for sometimes when it comes to cost management. And that's not a reason not to try to save money, but I think it's more critical to find out what are the best fits and what do those things then cost, rather than saying, what's the easiest way I can get the lowest number possible from a cost standpoint, and what do I get with that? And then lastly, make sure you have really good partners that don't just understand what they're delivering, but understand you, your needs, and your organization. Partners, benefits brokers, HR consultants, payroll, et cetera, they should all be driven by their need to help you, to help your employees, to help you advance your mission, your vision, and your values. Not just check a box, not just provide things on a annual basis. All right, here's your renewal. Let's just go through the motions, right? They should be proactive. They should be engaging. They should be equipping you. They should be providing education and advice. Really matters. And sometimes, again, in the benefit space, if you're working with a good broker, they don't have an additional charge to getting that advice. So you don't have to pay more necessarily. You can just really optimize things based on good relationships. Questions, comments, concerns, needs, desires, longings, or considerations?
We have a question in the chat for you, Brian, from Kathy.
Awesome. Okay, I haven't been looking at the chat, so thank you for telling me that. All right. Are all providers obligated to disclose compensation? I think the short answer is yes. The short answer is yes. I think certainly it's going to depend what it is they're proposing to you, but I think especially on the granular things, benefits, payroll, retirement plan, everything that has a fee or cost must be told, and it must be built out in black and white, from the underlying expenses to the investments of the retirement plan itself to, hey, this is how much we are going to charge you on a monthly basis for X, Y, and Z services if we're bundling things together. So yes, it is really important. And again, in most of the scenarios I've described to you, that is what happens. That's the way the market is. So, a PEO tells you this is how much it costs for us to, provide all these services. And usually it's either, a flat dollar charge or a certain percentage of payroll, or there's a couple of different ways that costs can be assessed. Payroll providers are similar in nature. Sometimes it's a per head fee, but, it needs to be very clear. Okay, this is what the fee is, and this is what you're getting for it. And by the way, if there's ambiguity with that, you need to dig deeper, or maybe that rules certain parties out. If they're not willing to be very clear, they probably aren't going to be a good fit, in my opinion. Hopefully I answered that though. What is the meaning of this photo? I just think it's a funny one that for those of us who were at this event in Columbus, it just makes me think, all right, what do these guys got going on? What's their bright idea that I'm not aware of? Sorry. Thanks, Jay.
Brian, I got a question for you.
Yes.
We launched a service with a PPO about a year ago, and it's one of the largest PPOs out there. And we've had some really sticky issues where we've had some employee relations issues where the PPO has basically dictated how we handle some of those situations with those employees, which myself with an HR background have thought have been absolutely ridiculous and actually quite detrimental to the organization, the way they've chosen to handle those issues. From your vantage point, I realize that it's a co-employer relationship. So you got that co-employer relationship, but to what extent is an organization have the latitude under a PPO arrangement to basically ignore what they're saying, what their HR people are saying, how to deal with certain HR situations?
Yeah, so David, thank you for asking that question. This is where I get to put my disclaimer out. Like, I'm not an attorney or an HR consultant. I just play one on TV. So with that out of the way, I think that, you know, A, you want to make sure you understand the legal framework, depending what the issue is. So I'm not, you know, I'm not going to ask you to give me any context for it, but there are certainly some sticky issues. And frankly, to be very, very transparent, this can be one of the challenges of a PEO arrangement, is that because this isn't you, these aren't just your employees, right? Then you're kind of bifurcating that responsibility. And so, you know, what we've seen most people do is, you know, you really do have to still try to, I think, control your controllables about culture, engagement, what are your policies and procedures, because that's, you know, again, that is still in your purview to do. And then I think have some very challenging, tough conversations about, you know, the who's on first part of how things can be handled.
Yeah, let me give you a specific here,
Sure,
because
please.
this would actually, we had a couple of instances where, and our perception is that the HR generalist assigned by the company to our account is quite junior. And again, we had several situations where discipline was really required of a couple of employees, but rather what we felt the measure of discipline should be, they wanted to jump immediately to termination or immediately to a written warning, where we felt, my leadership team felt that it was much more warranted of an oral warning, and it just created a lot of problems by having to go down that path of the written warning in that particular case. So that's the context there.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate further clarity, because I think your example is a really good one, where so first of all, it's very important to read this part of those agreements, and some of them will be more detailed about, you know, this type of area as to what they will do, how they would handle things. Some of them are less detailed or intentionally vague. And I always, when we support our clients, those that have PEOs, we say, you know, regardless of this relationship, how would you and how do you want to handle your policies and your procedures as an organization? Forget the relationship for a second. Write it out, build it out that way. What does your culture dictate that you do? And how do you certainly, you know, quantify that and, you know, your policies, how do you communicate that? And how do you want to handle discipline? How do you want to handle these types of issues? What are the steps that are going to be taken? What would an employee expect to have happen? And obviously, certainly, as long as that's very clear, it's buttoned up, and that's the process that you agree to follow, and you follow it consistently. I think that's where, you know, we want our clients. That's the approach that they need to take. And so, if there's then an issue that the PEO has with you following your own policies and procedures, then, you know, you can kind of jump in and say, all right, well, you know, why is that your issue? And, you know, do you understand that we still have, based on how this employment relationship works, we still have the ability and frankly, the liability to do this. So usually we've found more often than not, PEOs understand that and will eventually, you know, abide by your protocol, unless there is a real legal reason why they wouldn't or shouldn't. If there's something super egregious that needs to be handled a certain way and you're reluctant to do it, doesn't sound like that's the case for you, obviously. So I think sometimes, though, again, this goes back to that other point, right? Clearly understanding who's on first, and also how, you know, how do you create the right framework for how this gets handled? That's where there is a lot of challenge in the PEO model, because I think those things don't necessarily come out up front, and then they play out when the situation happens, and all of a sudden you realize, oh, this wasn't clear, or I didn't know you were going to do it that way. So, you know, I think that's, you know, I say build things the way that you would build them, whether you had a PEO or not. Make sure that you then communicate that and the PEO understands. And outside of a live fire scenario, make sure that you and the parties involved understand who's on first, what the roles and responsibilities are going to look like. And if there are issues, you know, try to manage or navigate them as effectively as possible before you have to. right?
Thank you.
I think, obviously in presenting for quote unquote scary stories, I don't want anybody to get the example that we feel that any of these scenarios are not beneficial. They're just examples of problems. I think PEOs can be good. I think having payroll provide bundle solutions, they are a right fit in a lot of situations. I think it's just really, if I wasn't clear because I went really quickly, really seeing them for what they are. Things get marketed a lot of ways, and I think sometimes marketing does everybody a disservice because things seem one way. They seem to be, oh wow, look at how easy it is to kind of put all this together under one umbrella. But it then plays out, and then things come up, and all of a sudden we realize, oh well, what it is in practice isn't as helpful or beneficial as the way it looked like up front. And I think that's just, again, hopefully if I said that now 3 or 4 or 5 different times, that's the message I hope we can take away from that. Any other questions, comments, concerns? Any scenarios that you would like to air? The airing of grievances? I don't know. Anything you want to lob my way? That was a great example, David. Thank you. Appreciate that.
This is Emily. I just have a question around Cobra. What do you see with that? If there's a certain, is it by size of employee you have to offer Cobra? How does that typically work?
It is. So the federal threshold is 20.
Okay.
So that's the line of delineation for that as it goes federal Cobra versus below that, then it's state. And so the key is you need to understand how Cobra operates on a state-by-state basis, because Cobra applies to where people are located, right? So even though the proverbial office location would have the governing criteria for a lot of things, there are times when, again, somebody, in this area, we have a lot of employers in the, DC, Maryland, Virginia, some in, and yet they might have we had one situation with an employee in New York. And so the Cobra situation had to be handled based on how New York would have us handle it, not how DC, Maryland, or Virginia. So that's the part where, again, whoever's going to be supporting that, if it's through a PEO, if it's payroll or a benefits broker, or all of the above, right? You want to be clear about, what that would look like, and usually just have a process, a really clearly defined process for, okay, somebody is terminated, who handles the disclosures, who sends what can the employee expect? Do we have a clear packet that spells it all out? A lot of things can be eliminated by making sure that the partners that are supporting you give you what you need to do this. I think sometimes issues come up when you don't have that, and then somebody's terminated and then they don't get their Cobra packet because they weren't sure who was providing what. And unfortunately, and this is another payroll situation, while things should happen automatically because you terminate somebody in one system, they don't always, so even if that should have triggered something to go out, you still sometimes have to follow that all the way through, or discover that it isn't automatic and then, handle it differently. So that's another great question, and hopefully a good kind of scenario to say, a lot of these things you just want to know, you want to be clear up front. What should this look like, and who's going to have to do what? So that way I don't assume because you're bundling all this together, you're going to do all these things, because you may not.